The air in the California desert was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dry sagebrush and sun-baked earth. It was late 1945 and the war was officially over. But for Haruna Sato, the fighting had simply moved to a different kind of battlefield. She stood with 40 other women, all former Japanese Army nurses and support staff, behind the chain-link fence of Camp Harmony, a makeshift holding facility carved out of a decommissioned training base outside Pasadena. Haruna was a slight woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with a stillness that felt heavier than any man's swagger. Her gaze, flat and steady, missed nothing. This quiet intensity was exactly what irritated Captain Thomas Miller, the American officer in charge of the female detachment. Miller was a tall man, pale from spending the war pushing paperwork in the States, and he deeply resented having to manage a group of women he instinctively viewed as dangerous. Stubborn and fanatical, they looked like ghosts. "Sir," muttered Sergeant Davies, a young guard whose eyes kept flicking nervously toward Haruna. Davies wore his prejudice plainly, mistaking Haruna's stoicism for arrogance. Miller didn't take his eyes off Haruna. She hadn't flinched, hadn't shown any emotion, not when they were lined up, not when they were searched, and not when the gate clanged shut. "Ghosts, maybe, but they're not harmless. That one," Miller said, nodding toward Haruna, "she's the worst kind of trouble. Too quiet, too strong. They break the loud ones easily, Sergeant. It's the ones who carry their own weight, the ones who don't need to shout to defy you, that you have to watch." The barracks inside the fence were crude, rows of canvas cots, thin blankets, and bare light bulbs. As the women shuffled in, exhaustion etched on their faces, Haruna moved to the very end cot, the one closest to the single rattling window. She claimed it not for herself, but to be the eyes and ears for the group. Davies, keen to impress Miller, sauntered over. He pointed his rifle carelessly toward Haruna's meager bundle of possessions, a worn handkerchief and a wooden hair clip. "Hey, Samurai, you got a name? Or do we just call you Trouble?" Haruna paused, looking up slowly. Her Japanese was perfect, but her English was halting, yet clear. "My name is Haruna Sato," she said, her voice surprisingly low and steady. "I was a nurse. I am a prisoner of war. I follow the Geneva rules." Davies laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "A nurse, huh? Looks like you could snap in half if the wind picked up. We know about you people and your rules. You didn't follow any rules back in the jungle, did you?" He sneered, making a show of inspecting the hair clip before tossing it back onto the cot. "You're just another stubborn little piece of baggage we gotta deal with until the paperwork clears. Don't get any ideas, Sato. You might be tough in your head, but out here, you're nothing." Haruna picked up the clip, her fingers brushing the smooth wood. She met his gaze with that same unwavering look. It wasn't hatred in her eyes, just a vast, enduring pity for his foolish anger. She said nothing more. Davies, frustrated by her lack of reaction, stomped away. From the observation deck, Captain Miller watched the exchange. He saw Davies's bluster and Haruna's silent, crushing response. He didn't see fragility. He saw an unyielding steel that he knew would be his biggest challenge. He still believed her quiet strength was a threat, a symbol of the enemy's refusal to surrender entirely. What he failed to see was that Haruna's strength wasn't about defiance at all. It was about the heavy, painful responsibility she carried for the women around her. The first injustice Haruna faced was not the fence, but the misjudgment of her character. She was just beginning her long, quiet journey toward redemption, not for being a soldier, but for simply being misunderstood as a human being. The weeks in Camp Harmony settled into a grinding, monotonous routine. The days were long, filled with dust and the stifling quiet of women who knew they were watched. The meals were passable but repetitive, the air thick with tension, not just from the guards, but from the simple shared suffering of captivity. Haruna established herself without saying a word. She never complained. She took the hardest, most tedious chores, from scrubbing the latrines to fetching water from the distant tap. She always took the smallest portion of rice, the thinnest slice of bread. One evening, Sergeant Elias Vance was assigned to the night watch. Vance was a man in his late 50s, too old for combat, with deep, kindly lines around his eyes. He had seen enough war footage to hold the same prejudices as his younger comrades, but he also had a daughter back home who was about the same age as many of these women. He was a decent man struggling with an indecent situation. Around midnight, a low, ragged, coughing sound echoed through the barracks. It was Midori, a former medic who had been weakened by months of jungle warfare and was now fighting a persistent fever. Midori shivered violently, pulling her thin blanket tighter, but it offered little comfort against the desert night chill that seeped through the walls. Haruna, who slept nearby, rose silently. She moved like a shadow, taking care not to disturb the others. She didn't have medicine, but she had the one thing of value she still possessed: her shawl. It wasn't just any cloth. It was a simple, coarse wool wrap, but it had been given to her by her mother and carried the faint, lasting scent of Japanese pine and lavender. It was her last link to home, her comfort against the crushing reality of her captivity. Vance watched from his post outside the window, hidden in the shadows of the water tower. He saw Haruna approach Midori's cot. She didn't fuss or make a sound. She simply lifted the shawl, gently smoothed it out, and draped it over the shaking woman, tucking it under her chin. Midori's trembling lessened almost immediately, and she sighed, turning slightly toward the warmth. Then Haruna did something that truly caught Vance's attention. She went back to her own cot, but instead of lying down, she sat upright, pulling her knees to her chest. She put her arms, bare now in the cold air, inside her thin sleeves, and she began to rock almost imperceptibly, humming a tune so faint it was like the whisper of the wind. She was trying to generate warmth for herself without the shawl, sacrificing her only piece of true comfort for a sick friend. From his desk in the guardhouse, Captain Miller had stepped out for a cigarette. He spotted Vance standing rigidly by the water tower, staring intently at the barracks. Miller walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "What's the holdup, Sergeant Vance? See a ghost?" Miller asked, his voice low and cynical. Vance turned, startled. "No, Captain, just checking the perimeter." Miller glanced through the window himself. The harsh light barely reached the end cot, but he could see Haruna sitting up, a small, dark shape, watching the rest of the women sleep. He couldn't see the shawl on Midori, just Haruna's posture. "See? That's what I mean," Miller said, flicking his cigarette butt away. "She's not sleeping. She's studying us. She's trying to stay awake to maintain control, to show the others she's still in charge. It's always about power with them, Sergeant. Don't be fooled by the quiet act. She's a fanatic, holding on to her last scrap of influence." Miller walked away, his judgment confirmed. But Sergeant Vance remained. He had seen the sacrifice, not the power play. He saw a woman, cold and alone, giving away her last precious thing to save another from the chill. He stood there for a long time, the image of Haruna humming her faint, comforting song burned into his mind. He realized that this enemy he was supposed to hate wasn't a fanatic at all. She was simply loyal, a quality he had always admired in his own soldiers. That night, the seeds of doubt about his captain's prejudices were firmly planted in Elias Vance's heart. He felt a deep, unfamiliar pang of respect for the small, sitting figure, shivering in silence, sacrificing her comfort for her comrades. The duties of a clerk at Camp Harmony were rarely glamorous, usually involving inventory lists, ration counts, and endless forms. Sergeant Vance also had to catalog the confiscated personal effects of the prisoners. These were items deemed potentially dangerous or simply too personal to be allowed in the barracks: small wooden boxes, letters, photos, and cheap jewelry. It was a tedious, joyless task. One afternoon, while sifting through a wooden cigar box belonging to Haruna Sato, Vance and his young helper, Corporal Jenkins, found a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't a military log or a diary filled with political sentiment. It was tiny, no bigger than a postcard, its pages filled with neat, precise Japanese calligraphy. Vance had Jenkins translate the basic contents. Most of it was mundane: recipes for foods they couldn't possibly get, snippets of old poems, and careful drawings of flowers they hadn't seen in months. But then, Vance noticed something odd. On one page, a small calendar had been meticulously drawn in pencil, covering the last 3 months of the year. Certain dates were not only circled in faint red, but also marked with a small, stylized symbol, a simple, tiny drawing of a flame or a small, round cake. Jenkins frowned. "What are these, Sergeant? Looks like some kind of code, maybe for meeting dates?" Vance shook his head, a thoughtful frown wrinkling his brow. "No, Corporal. Look at the symbols. See how they're all different sizes? This one is large, that one is small, but they're all on different days, scattered across the calendar." He pointed to a small, isolated circle in the upcoming week. "What if it's not a code for defiance? What if it's just a date?" Jenkins squinted at the small cake drawing next to the upcoming circled date. "A party, Sergeant? In a prison camp?" Vance's heart felt a strange, unexpected squeeze. He realized what he was looking at. The women were keeping track of each other's birthdays. In the harsh, dehumanizing reality of the POW camp, these former enemy soldiers were clinging to the most basic human milestones. They were holding on to the simple, precious fact of their existence. The small drawings, the private calendar, it was a quiet act of dignity, a way of affirming to one another that they were still individuals, still people and still loved by someone, somewhere. Vance checked the date circled next week. It belonged to the name written beneath it, Aya Tanaka. Aya was one of the youngest prisoners, barely 20 years old, always quiet and anxious. Her birthday was coming up, and Haruna had somehow made a note of it, trying to keep the small flame of humanity alive for her friend. "Put this back, Jenkins," Vance said, his voice unusually firm. "Don't say a word about this book. Not to anyone, especially not to the captain." Jenkins, sensing the shift in his superior's mood, simply nodded. Vance returned to his lonely desk. He thought about his own daughter's last birthday. A big cake, too many candles, a messy kitchen. He thought about the shivering Haruna giving away her shawl. And now this, a secret, desperate calendar of life. Captain Miller's constant, bitter talk about fanaticism and threats suddenly seemed thin and hollow compared to the reality of these small, heartbreaking acts of human loyalty. A dangerous, wild idea began to form in Vance's mind, an idea that defied every regulation and every unspoken rule of their temporary prison. He was tired of the hatred. He was tired of seeing humans reduced to symbols. He wanted to do one small thing, one completely unnecessary and completely human thing that might stand against the coldness of war. He decided right then and there that Aya Tanaka and the other women were going to have a birthday cake, even if it cost him his stripes. The secret discovery of the birthday list was not just a revelation of the women's humanity. It was the spark that ignited Sergeant Vance's own long-dormant conscience. He knew this would have to be a quiet conspiracy, a mission of mercy against the orders of his own captain. The first task was finding allies. Vance knew he couldn't do this alone. He chose 2 men, Private First Class Mac McAllister, a cook who grumbled constantly but secretly loved baking, and Staff Sergeant Otis Oat Johnson, an older logistics man who had the uncanny ability to make things, anything, appear without paperwork. Both men, like Vance, were weary of the post-war bitterness. Vance found McAllister wiping down the stainless steel in the mess hall late that night. He laid the plan out simply. "Next Tuesday is one of the girls' birthdays. I want a cake, Mac, a real one. Flour, eggs, sugar, and some kind of frosting." McAllister looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "A cake? For a POW, Sergeant? You know what Captain Miller would do? He'd string us up by our ankles. We'd be peeling potatoes in Siberia." "Miller doesn't need to know," Vance replied calmly. "This isn't about politics or the war, Mac. It's about being decent. I saw her. The birthday girl. She's just a kid. I saw what they do for each other. They're hanging onto a thread, Mac. Let's throw them a rope." McAllister, after a long silence, wiped his hands on a rag. "Sugar is rationed hard, Elias. And eggs? We don't have enough. You're asking me to steal from the army." "Oat will handle the supplies," Vance promised. Sergeant Johnson, recruited next, was harder to convince. He was a man of procedure. "My friend, you are asking me to risk my entire pension for flour and sprinkles. This is an act of treason to the paperwork system. It's an act of peace, Otis, Vance countered. The war is over. Let's start acting like it. It'll be a very small cake, just a little one, for Aya Tanaka. Johnson finally sighed, rolling his eyes but a slight smile playing on his lips. Aya Tanaka, huh? All right, but I want that little cake drawing that started this craziness. It's better than a medal. The conspiracy began. McAllister started hiding small amounts of butter and sugar from the main supply. Johnson, through his network of old Army buddies in town, managed to acquire a few boxes of cake mix and a can of vanilla frosting, labeling them on his manifest as Engine Cleaning Compound, Type C. Meanwhile, Captain Miller's suspicions were rising like a bad odor. He noticed Vance's increased secrecy, McAllister's sudden good mood, and the fact that Johnson's supply logs were slightly, inexplicably off. He watched them confer in quiet, conspiratorial whispers near the motor pool. What are they plotting? Miller muttered to himself. He was convinced they were organizing a revolt, maybe trying to sneak in weapons or maps to the prisoners. He had his own deep-seated fears and biases, and they were fueling his paranoia. He began staying late, circling the camp at odd hours, watching the barracks and the guardhouse with heightened intensity. Haruna, inside the barracks, noticed the shift immediately. She was a master observer, her quiet strength born from years of relying on reading unspoken signals. The American guards were usually bored, predictable, and resentful. But now some of them, Vance, McAllister, and Johnson, were different. They were jumpy, secretive, and sometimes she caught them looking at the women with an expression that was neither hate nor pity, but something that looked unsettlingly like anticipation. Haruna mentally prepared for the worst. Anticipation in a guard usually meant a search, a punishment, or a new restriction. She gathered the women's few cherished scraps, a piece of ribbon, a broken comb, a pressed flower, and secreted them into the corner of the room, ready to hide or destroy them if a violent search came. She felt the heavy weight of responsibility again, the pressure to protect her comrades from this new, strange tension. She didn't know what the guards were planning, but she resolved to face it with her usual silence and strength, ready to take the blame for whatever they were hiding, to ensure the others were spared the captain's wrath. The morning of Tuesday arrived, cold and overcast. It was Aya Tanaka's 21st birthday. The women knew it. Haruna had caught Aya's eye and given the slightest, almost invisible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the day. Haruna was scrubbing the floor of the barracks when the outer doors burst open. It wasn't Sergeant Vance. It was Captain Miller. His face was a mask of cold fury. He was dragging Sergeant Vance by the arm, gripping him tight. "I knew it," Miller roared, his voice echoing off the corrugated iron walls. "I knew you were up to something, Sergeant." "Conspiring! You and McAllister and Johnson? I saw the flower on his uniform, Vance. What were you planning? An escape route? Smuggling in maps? I demand you tell me what treason you've been cooking up." The women froze, their meager morning routine halted by the storm of the captain's rage. Haruna straightened slowly, placing the scrubbing brush down. She prepared to speak, to take responsibility, convinced that Vance had been trying to help them in some misguided way and was now facing the consequences. Vance stood stiffly, looking down at the floor. "It's not treason, Captain. It's a personal matter." "Personal? In a military facility? You think I'm an idiot? I knew that one," Miller spat, pointing a finger at Haruna, who stood perfectly still. "I knew she was trouble. She must have manipulated you, Vance, convinced you she was plotting something." Just as Miller raised his hand, seemingly ready to strike Vance, the main barrack door was thrown open again. It wasn't a squad of armed men, but McAllister and Johnson. They were standing side by side, their faces nervous but defiant, and they were carrying a large, wobbly metal tray. On the tray were 4 small, pitifully lopsided, but recognizably decorated birthday cakes. They were unevenly frosted with bright vanilla icing, and each one had a few mismatched, flickering candles stuck into the top. Johnson, his hands shaking slightly, held up a crudely lettered sign scrawled on the back of an old laundry ticket. "Happy birthday, Aya, Hana, Chio, and Rico." 4 birthdays had fallen within the secret 2-week period. A profound, suffocating silence fell over the room. The only sound was the crackle of the tiny candle flames. The Japanese women, hardened by war and months of captivity, stared. They weren't staring at the cakes, but at the action. They stared at the American soldiers, their enemy, who had risked their careers, maybe even their freedom, to bake something sweet for them. The astonishment was absolute. Aya, the young woman whose birthday had been the catalyst, began to cry. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of pure, shocked recognition. Captain Miller's hand, still raised in a threat against Vance, slowly lowered. His face, moments ago contorted with fury and prejudice, went slack. He looked at the garish cakes, the trembling candles, and then at the utter total bewilderment of the 40 women. He saw Haruna, the unyielding fanatic, with tears silently tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. In that moment, the years of propaganda, the ingrained bitterness, and his personal resentments broke. He saw not the symbol of the enemy, but the simple fact that a group of old men had just performed an act of extravagant, vulnerable kindness for a group of young women. He realized the treason was simply the bold decision to treat other people as people. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just stood there, caught between the rules he had sworn to uphold and the humanity he was witnessing. The climax wasn't a fight. It was a moment of grace. The cake itself was the only weapon, and it had completely disarmed Captain Thomas Miller. The cakes were served. The women ate in stunned silence, savoring the unnatural, overwhelming sweetness of the stolen sugar. Captain Miller walked away from the barracks, not in triumph, but in a defeated daze, leaving Vance, McAllister, and Johnson to supervise the unprecedented, unofficial celebration. Later that afternoon, Miller called Vance into his office. He looked tired, his posture slumped. "I should court-martial you, Vance, all of you. You broke every rule, compromised security, and defied a direct order." Vance simply nodded, ready to accept the punishment. "Yes, sir. But you didn't smuggle a weapon, did you?" Miller asked, staring at the scarred wooden desk. "You smuggled flour." Before Vance could answer, there was a knock on the office door. It was Haruna Sato. She stood in the doorway, quiet but radiating an unmistakable purpose. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice still quiet but steadier than ever. "May I speak with you?" "Alone." Miller was startled, but for the first time he hesitated before refusing. He nodded curtly to Vance, who left the room. Haruna stepped inside and the door closed. "I am grateful for the kindness," Haruna began, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "But I did not come here to say thank you for the cake." Miller looked up, surprised. "Then why are you here, Sato? To defy me again?" Haruna met his gaze. "I came to ask for justice. You thought my quietness was defiance. You thought I was trying to maintain power over my comrades. You were wrong, Captain. For weeks I have been protecting something." She then revealed the truth. It wasn't an escape plan. She had been guarding evidence of a petty but humiliating injustice. One of the night guards, not Davies but another junior soldier, had been systematically stealing small items, a gold locket, a pair of glasses, a handful of dried tea leaves, from the women's confiscated belongings, selling them in the nearby town. Haruna had caught him and managed to acquire a small piece of proof, a receipt accidentally dropped by the guard detailing the sale of a prisoner's locket. This was the reason for her intense vigilance and her unwavering focus. She was gathering the courage and waiting for the right moment to expose the truth without risking further punishment for her friends. "I knew if I reported this earlier, you would see it as a desperate ploy by a fanatic," Haruna explained, her voice low. "I knew you would punish all of us for the action of one thief. But today you showed us kindness. You showed that decency exists even here. And now I ask that you match that decency with justice." Miller looked at the scrap of paper Haruna presented. He studied the receipt, the guard's sloppy handwriting, and the details of the stolen locket. His face, which had been conflicted since the cakes, settled into a look of cold, grim resolve. He realized the true nature of Haruna's strength. It wasn't the strength of a fanatic seeking control. It was the selfless strength of a protector, willing to endure scorn and suspicion for the good of others. The powerful twist was not a physical revenge, but a moral and emotional one. Haruna used the American soldiers' unexpected act of grace as a lever to force the issue of the camp's internal corruption. Miller didn't hesitate. He took the receipt. He didn't apologize for his prejudice, but his actions spoke louder than any words. He launched an immediate, quiet investigation. Within 48 hours, the thieving guard was relieved of duty and transferred out of the command, facing a formal inquiry. The stolen items were quietly retrieved and placed back in the women's collection. A few days later, as the women were being prepared for transport to a more permanent facility, Haruna was standing by the fence. Captain Miller approached her, not as her commander, but as one soldier to another. He didn't speak of the theft or the cakes. He simply offered a brief nod. "Sato, you showed great courage." Haruna met his eyes, and for the first time since her arrival, the severity of her expression eased. She returned the nod, a small, profound gesture of mutual respect finally earned. The fence was still between them, but the wall of prejudice had finally begun to crumble. Haruna had not just survived the injustice. By remaining true to her commitment to others, she had redeemed her own character in the eyes of her former enemy, transforming a moment of forced charity into a true victory for truth and human dignity.